Welcome to Mindshift. I'm Brandon, and we get to talk about my favorite gospel today, and that is the Gospel of Mark, episode 41 of my secular Bible study series. Mark is quick, it is action-packed, it is urgent, and it focuses on a unique characteristic of Jesus being more servant-like. That's not to say there's not messianic claims, there are, but it's more of this messianic secret, which I think is kind of interesting. John is probably the most interesting gospel overall because of its theological differences, and then Matthew and Luke are just wild in what they're trying to create and how they're trying to elevate Jesus and remove some of the issues from Mark. They were both working from Mark, that's absolutely clear. And really quick, I do want to point out, if you watch Matthew, you'll have the base layer you need to understand the gospel, and now we can get into the differences. And that is how I'm going to view covering Mark, Luke, and John. What are the differences? We are going to compare gospel to gospel since we got all the work done in Matthew. We will still follow the same 7 steps, so let us begin. Step 1, book overview. And we're going to break up the 16 chapters of Mark instead of the 28 in Matthew. Again, this is shorter, it is more precise. We're going to break this up into just 5 segments. So for segment 1, it's going to be chapters 1 through 3. And I'm going to just read you the beginning of Mark here. Again, keep in mind, this would have been the first gospel account actually recorded, and it says, "The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet. Behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way. The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight." It's a really neat beginning, honestly. And first of all, it skips all of the genealogy and birth narratives that Matthew and Luke cover, which is just furthermore evidence that, again, you have Matthew and Luke reading Mark and possibly a hypothetical second source Q, which are just teachings and sayings of Jesus. And they obviously have an agenda goal of proving more than Mark does that Jesus is the Messiah. And thus they are doing all of these things to get him in the right place, to be born in the right place, or out of Egypt, or coming from Bethlehem, or called a Nazarene. They're also utilizing his lineage to show that he's from the line of David and that he meets all those prophetic requirements. But Mark's not doing any of that. Mark tells us one prophecy from Isaiah about a messenger that prepares the way, and then he immediately in verse 4 gets to this. John appeared, baptizing in the wilderness. So he moves straight to John the Baptist, and that's his callback to prophecy. One that is only slightly to do with Jesus, and that was simply apparently unacceptable to the writers of Matthew and Luke. Also, quick caveat, when I say, oh, Mark said this or Luke said that, I'm just talking in reference to the book. So, key events that are happening in these first 3 chapters would be Jesus' baptism by John the Baptist, the temptation in the wilderness, and the beginning of his preaching, teaching, healings, exorcisms in Galilee. Remember, this is action-packed. We have way less parables and way more concise teachings of Jesus. And in those miracles and healings is where we start to see already this messianic secret. This again is something unique to Mark. Jesus will ask people to keep it a secret. Don't go and tell people what I have done, which is in direct opposition to when he does other miracles and healings in Matthew and Luke predominantly, where it is to show and prove that he is the Messiah. Again, they had to be more bold than what Mark was willing to do, so they needed more people to be sharing their perspective of him being the Messiah. Even in this book, and we'll get to it, when Jesus asked Peter and some of the other followers, "Who do you think I am?" and they answer, "The Messiah," he says, "Hush though, keep it down." So that's very interesting. But let's move on to segment 2, which is going to be Mark 4 through Mark 8, roughly. And we'll call this his growing ministry and growing conflict. We start to see some issues with the Pharisees, which I'm not going to cover in much detail here. But if you missed last Sunday's video, now that we're in the Gospels in the New Testament, you're going to start seeing a lot more content from me about this. And we covered why I think the Pharisees had every right to doubt Jesus as the Messiah, and the issues that that leads to in terms of the conflict between the God of the Old Testament and the character and display of Jesus Christ. We do get some parables in Mark, and the main one where we get the most detail is the parable of the sower that happens in Mark chapter 4. But again, Mark uses way less of Jesus's parables. Maybe he didn't have access to them. It doesn't seem like Mark had access to the Q source that we referenced. There is an idea that he was just limited with some of the oral myth building that had happened over the next few decades before Matthew and then Luke are going to get their stab at it. And it's not like Mark is all that recent. Again, we'll get to the dating here in a second, though. In addition to the parable of the sower, we get the calming of the storm, a major run-in with a demon. We get the story of Jairus's daughter, the resurrection. And just to geek out for a second from a literary background, which is my favorite way of looking at this, it is just literature. Mark chapter 5 utilizes a cool literary technique called intercalation, which is just a fancy word for a story within a story. And we get the story of the woman with the issue of blood, Mark 5:22. So pretty neat. We'll talk more about that in point 4. And again, stay around to the end. Point 7 is where we're going to look at all the contradictions, gospel to gospel, as well as the problematic passages. We also have the feeding of the 5,000, the death of John the Baptist. So a lot is happening here. And again, some of that growing conflict. We have some really interesting critiques from the Pharisees in relation to tradition and the commandments. Let's move on to segment 3, which is going to be the last part of chapter 8, moving all the way through chapter 10. And sorry, I recognize you guys can't see off screen. I'm looking down a lot because I'm looking at the Bible here. But the reason that I segmented it at the end of chapter 8 is because we get a big tonal change at the end of 8. We start getting into more messianic territory. The beginning of 8 is miracles and healings, but at the end we get verse 27. And Jesus went up with his disciples to the village in Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they told him, and I think this is interesting. Here's what they've heard the people guess at. Some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, and others one of the prophets. Notice that none of the Jewish people up to this point, despite everything that Jesus is doing, think that he's the Messiah. And it's not like they don't know about this concept. It's that he's not matching up, similar to what I covered in my Pharisee episode. And it's almost as if the author of Mark knows that these people aren't considering Jesus to be the Messiah. So he's writing the insider's perspective to lay this on pretty heavy. And he asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" To which Peter answered, "You are the Christ." And he strictly charged them not to tell anyone about him. So again, the messianic secret. But here, even though it's not as blatant as what Matthew and Luke do, Mark is still trying to convey the same thing. This is decades after their Savior was put to death. And there have been many different versions and stories floating around. And all that stuff about the 500 witnesses, this isn't until Paul makes that claim later. The resurrection apparently is just not common knowledge to everyone at this point, or we'd have way more sources of it, and it wouldn't have taken 35 to 40 years to get it off the ground. And so you can see the writer of Mark combating that. Yeah, the people were lost, confused. They thought he was just a great prophet. But when Jesus asked his closest friends, the most important people to the story, who he was, crystal clear answer: you are the Christ. You are the Messiah. Jesus's secrecy here with it is almost like, it seems to me like two different takes. Mark has the secrecy because, again, how else do you explain how all these people didn't think he was the Messiah? And why is it just getting out now as these gospel writers are starting to come about telling the account that he is indeed the Messiah? It's because Jesus wanted it that way. But again, a few decades after this, Matthew and Luke don't like that, and we have them plastering Jesus as the Messiah, with everybody being clearly aware that this was indeed the case. Again, this is what I mean when I talk about the evolution of the Gospels. And by John, it's just theologically impossible to consider that Jesus was never the Messiah all along. So fascinating stuff, really, but I'm spending too much time here. Let's continue on. Then we get Jesus foretelling his death and resurrection. I think that happens 3 times in this gospel where he points to his death. That is a lot why this gospel refers to Jesus more as the suffering servant. In fact, it's within this part, I'm not going to keep reading to you, where he explains to the disciples, who, by the way, thought they were going to be like, hanging with the next king, as this was the idea of the Messiah. And Jesus is correcting them, saying, no, the first will be last. Even I have come to serve. And so we get the suffering servant. This is a big allusion back to Isaiah 53, which we'll make a video on, but I have covered in my Isaiah Secular Bible Study episode why that was never about Jesus. And then we get the transfiguration, which is a huge happening. This is where we start to get that fun Christian persecution complex about denying yourself and carrying your own cross and all of the things that it means to truly follow Christ. We get teachings about divorce, the story of the rich young man, the third time he foretells his death, and then the request of James and John to be seated at the right hand of the Father. And that is actually where Jesus explains like, hey, this isn't for me to decide. These things have already been set in motion. Plus, you shouldn't care about these things anyways. Now he's addressing all of his followers because once again, and I'll quote it here, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Even the idea that the Messiah was going to be a sacrificial figure is not biblical. It is not in the Torah. It is not in the Old Testament. This is after the fact manipulation of the idea. That's why Jesus has to explain it in Mark when the writer of Mark already knows that this Messiah figure died. That's a fact they have to deal with. So let's get him resurrected. Let's make it sacrificial. Let's totally turn this on its head. And thus we have a new religion. This is the difference between Judaism and Christianity. It's happening right before our eyes. But let's move on to segment 4, which is going to be chapters 11 through 13. We start off in 11 with the triumphal entry and the cursing of the fig tree, the cleansing of the temple. I think that the cleansing of the temple and the fig tree are ones that I know it's easy to make fun of, like, oh, Jesus didn't know that tree was out of season. But in lieu of the cleansing of the temple following that, the fig tree serves as an example. It's a metaphor, albeit I think a ridiculous one and one that could have been done much better. It shows Jesus in a poor light that most people are not going to understand. But I do also love calling out incorrect things that atheists like to harp on when it's like, no, there's a pretty good explanation for that. There's enough real issues in this book to never have to deal with the silly ones or the incorrect ones. But we can cover that on another video. Then we get the paying taxes to Caesar. In fact, it's these verses in Mark 10, starting at chapter 13, that I did my very first exegetical paper on. It just takes me back to Bible college. Here we get a lot of confrontation with both the Sadducees and the Pharisees, discussions of the second coming, which also would not have been biblical according to the Old Testament, and the institution of the Last Supper. Mark 13, by the way, is known as the Olivet Discourse. It's where we get a really unique perspective on, again, the apocalyptic teachings and the importance for readiness and vigilance. And it's quite the different tone than we see elsewhere, or at least starts to set the stage for such. And then we end with section 5, and that's 14 to 16. And it takes us all the way from the plot to kill Jesus in 14 through Judas's betrayal, the Passover with the disciples, Peter's denial, the betrayal and arrest of Jesus, the trial and the council, delivered to Pilate, the sentencing to be crucified, Jesus being mocked, the crucifixion itself, the death of Jesus. And it's so interesting going through and reading these Gospels again. I read each book before I cover it, and I'm always shocked. Always. You know, the crucifixion is 13 verses. This huge thing that we have drawn out and extrapolated so much and assigned so much to is 13 verses. We have longer sections of Bible telling us how to put tents together properly. We have longer sets of instructions on the things not to put in our mouths, even though Jesus will say so clearly that what goes into the mouth is not what defiles it. Now, granted, we have 4 Gospels. We have 4 recurrences of this, but that only adds to the problem because they don't agree with one another. And then we have the resurrection. Now, the very interesting thing about Mark is his resurrection story is very, very quick. 8 verses. And it ends like this. And they went out and fled from the tomb, the women, by the way, who had been the first to visit, for trembling and astonishment had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. That's how Mark ends. Our first recorded explanation of the resurrection. The women went to the tomb, saw that he was not there, were supposed to go and tell everyone, but didn't because they were afraid. The end. But then there's a whole section added, and in most Bibles it should tell you something like mine says, some of the earliest manuscripts do not include Mark 16, 9 through 20, which is convenient and inconvenient. If this were our only gospel, it would be a problem that this wasn't included. It would leave out so much that becomes so paramount. But unfortunately, in this section that is later added to Mark, where we get some more details that help fill those gaps, we also get the Great Commission that has a few highly problematic verses to how Christians should actually be living their lifestyle. So what is covered in this edition of 16, 9 through 20? We get Jesus appearing to Mary Magdalene, and now she can go and actually tell the people that we're supposed to hear. Then we have Jesus appearing to 2 disciples. And the interesting thing here in verse 13, and they went back and told the rest, but they did not believe them. Again, this is so common and it's so ridiculed by the modern Christian. Oh, all these people, their lack of faith. It's like, hey, This isn't what the Messiah was supposed to do. The second Jesus was hung on that cross, most Jewish messianic expectations, if they even had them of this man, were immediately gone. He did not build the temple. He did not unify all the tribes back in the homeland. He did not usher in a world of peace. He did not unify the idea of God so that all would know this universal understanding of the true God. These things didn't happen. The second he was nailed to the cross, it was over. So yeah, hearing that he came back from the dead, not part of the story, not supposed to happen. I think that's fascinating. But then in verse 14, we get the Great Commission. So now he's appeared to everyone. He's giving his proclamations about what they need to do. And in 17, he says this, "And these signs will accompany those who believe. In my name, they will cast out demons. They will speak in new tongues. They will pick up serpents with their hands. And if they drink any deadly poison, it will not hurt them. They will lay their hands on the sick and they will recover." So then the Lord Jesus, after he had spoken to them, was taken up into heaven and sat down at the right hand of God. And they went out and preached everywhere, while the Lord worked with them and confirmed the message by accompanying signs. So, signs prove the message, something many Christians still struggle with. Christians are 100% empowered by the Spirit of God. Anyone who follows him is supposed to be able to do these things. It says, signs will accompany those who believe in my name. That's it. That's the only qualifier. Those who believe in my name. So if you're at a more progressive or traditional church even that kind of misses the whole evangelical movement, the question would be, why? Why aren't you healing the sick? Why aren't you casting out demons? Why aren't you out there playing with snakes to prove the poison doesn't get to you? By the way, don't do that. If you guys haven't seen those documentaries about the churches in the South that do the snake handling and how many of those pastors and congregants have died, and then the excuses that they make in the goalpost moving, it's tragic and hilarious, but mainly tragic. So that's it. That's the book overview. We have problems here, right? We have a very different Jesus. When we look at Matthew's Jesus, the reason I put a crown on him in the thumbnail is because Matthew's Jesus was king. He came to clearly be king, to clearly be Messiah, to set up, in an answer to the fact that he didn't do it on earth, a new spiritual kingdom. And even that is a fix from what Matthew observed to be wrong with Mark, the suffering servant, the lowly. And we see it in everything. We see it in the differences of how he reacts as he's dying on the cross. You know, here in Mark, he quotes, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Which many people take wrong. They think Jesus is having some moment of doubt. It's not that. He is quoting back to a psalm that starts in that way, which is how you would have indicated what verse you were talking about, kind of how we say chapter and verse. He's just quoting from that psalm, and it has a greater meaning. It's kind of nice, but it still reflects this very different suffering servant Jesus, as opposed to it is finished, which is much more mission focused, a man with a plan. Again, the evolution of Jesus. So before we move on to point 2, I just want to recap some of the main differences in Mark. 1, just removing so much proof of him being the Messiah. Again, things like the lineage and birth narrative. The emphasis on rather showing via miracles and healings, action-oriented. The difference in teaching style. Forget all those parables. We'll include a couple of the major ones, but I want concise teaching. The role of women is great in Mark, except for the fact that they run away in fear, disobeying Jesus in the end, still struggling with their disbelief. And then the biggest one here, other than Jesus portrayed more as a servant than a king, would be the messianic secret. Let's move into part 2, authorship and date. The traditional authorship gives it to Mark, fully known as John Mark, who is a figure mentioned in several New Testament books. He is mentioned as a cousin of Barnabas and a cohort or friend even to the Apostle Peter. And really this idea comes to us from the early church fathers, specifically Papias, who wrote that John Mark was a translator and often scribe for Peter, but it does not line up with the scholarly approach to this book. The first thing that many scholars will assume is that it was written by a group of early Christian believers and not necessarily just an individual man. This communal authorship theory, as it's known, is not really that crazy. In fact, much of what gets amalgamated and combined for the Old Testament was probably a group effort to some degree, even if we did have snippets of individual prophets that had written things down or had things written down about them. When it came to the editing and redacting period that took place a lot during the post-exile period, we see traces of community effort, communal authorship. Again, the scholarly approach to dating puts it at 65 to 70 CE. This dating aligns with this period that we talked about in my last video on the Pharisees of the First Jewish-Roman War. And of course, following that, the destruction of the Second Temple, which happened in 70 CE. This idea from Mark of endurance and suffering and sacrifice really aligns well with what Christians would have been going through at this time. And as we've already covered, Mark has some textual inconsistencies, to say the least, and textual variants, one of which we've already covered with the ending of Mark 16, so I won't rehash that. But other textual variants in Mark have to do with word choice and syntax and structure across the various manuscripts. We see differences here. And all it does is raise questions about the transmission and the preservation of these texts, which is a big deal, right? We're trying to trace back to what is true, what's correct, what's the original, how do we know, when did it happen? And when you have all of these textual variants, you're going to have issues answering those questions. And I'm being shorter here because we covered a lot of this in Matthew, and even more so for section 3 here, historical background, accuracy, and context. This is going to be pretty much the exact same thing that I said in Matthew. So we're going to leave it alone and skip straight to part 4, which is literary analysis. And here we can say some unique things about Mark. One is its narrative structure. It's really simple. It's extremely chronological. We can see it in 3 very clear sections, even though I went into 5 for more detail. But if we were just doing its 3 main as it's typically broken down, we have Jesus's baptism and early ministry, Jesus's journey to Jerusalem, and then Jesus's death and resurrection. And again, all the while, it is action-packed and it is urgent. We are moving forward. Everything is quicker. Everything is faster. Everything is straight away or immediate are the words that are used over and over and over. In terms of techniques, we talked about intercalation or sandwiching. We talked about the messianic secret. Mark has a lot of repetition. Even though it's shorter in 16 chapters and punchy, it is making the same point over and over multiple times. And again, even for its direct, straightforward approach, it still uses a lot of symbolism and imagery like all the Gospels do. In Mark, we see it with the withering of the fig tree. We see it with the veil being torn at the time of crucifixion. That's something that is just going to be employed in all the Gospels, maybe even less in Mark than others, but still enough to call it out as one of its main literary techniques. But all of that together makes this a very dynamic, very dramatic, and very engaging narrative story of the life of Jesus. So moving on, point 5, main themes. Is there really any different themes between the 4 Gospels? Well, yes and no. It's more about how they choose to convey the themes. You know, the first thing that we have to understand, even with Mark and all the Gospels, is they are trying to establish this particular character, Jesus, as Messiah. They do it in their own unique ways, with their own unique different kinds of storytelling, with their own perspectives and points of view, with how they link to prophecy, when they do, when they don't, what parts of Jesus's life they choose to cover and not. And by the way, can we just talk about how interesting it is, especially if this was traditional authorship, eyewitness accounts, that we have so very little on the early years of Jesus. Now, some of the Gnostic texts actually give us a lot of stories, but other than Jesus' birth and other than him having a few showdowns in the temple around age 12 or whatever it was, we don't get much of this man for 30 years of his life. And as someone who is the Son of God, who had magic flowing through his veins, who could read the minds of other people, I mean, what, did he just not get his powers until his baptism? That's a theory some people say. But if he didn't have any of his powers, how did he avoid sin for 30 years, which is such an important part to the sacrificial story? There's a whole line of thinking here and issues that we could definitely get into on why the Gospels only cover what they do and how they do, but we'll leave it alone. The point is, a main theme is definitely to try to make Jesus the Messiah. Mark, like everyone else, focuses on the call to discipleship. We don't just have a Messiah, we have a Messiah that wants followers. Those followers have the job of creating more followers. It's maybe the first great pyramid scheme, which I know sounds a bit blasphemous and cheeky, but again, this is how you get a religion that spreads and that survives the test of time. A directive from the mouth of Jesus himself to his followers to make more followers. Believe it or not all religions have this, and many of the religions that didn't, along with a big carrot and stick, have died out. That's like the 3-ingredient process to making a successful religion: a threat of punishment to create fear, a promise of a better tomorrow to create hope, and a call to action to keep the whole thing going. One that I didn't mention with Matthew might be the nature of faith. Faith plays a big role in Mark. It is by faith that these healings and exorcisms happen. Faith is the answer to the pressing questions from the Pharisees and the other scribes. And one last theme that might be unique to Mark here is the suffering servant, which we've talked about at great detail. But this is, again, flipping the idea of the Messiah on its head. And as you can see throughout reading this gospel, force-feeding it down the throats of people that otherwise would not have seen it. As for point 6, if you watched Matthew, you know that I skipped it, because talking about the influence of the gospel is like talking about the influence of Christianity. And it's not something that's going to happen in a 5-minute follow-up. So I'm saying it now. For these 4 gospels, we're not going to talk that much about point 6, reception and influence. I will say from a scholarly impact, the influence is really important. This is what's known as Markan priority, the understanding that Mark not only came first, but was utilized by both Matthew and Luke. Then you add into that the things like the messianic secret and the abrupt ending, and you have yourself a whole delightful dish to dive into to try to understand what is happening in the first accepted account of the life, death, and resurrection of the Jesus figure. It really is fascinating, and Mark starts the whole thing off. So, with that said, let's get into everyone's favorite section, Part 7, Contradictions and Problematic Passages. Let's start with contradictions, and I again have a list for us. And I want to start this and be really careful with the caveat that not everything I'm about to list is actually a contradiction. Some of them are just differences, and I think they're worth pointing out, and I think that they still show major issues. Again, we've talked about the evolution that happens between Mark and then Matthew and Luke, and even those differences, and then John. We see them filling in theological gaps as they go and raising the character of Jesus up ever higher, distinguishing more ideas about what it is to be saved and what the afterlife is like and what the apocalypse or second coming is going to be, etc. There's just this huge evolution at play. So if I say something, you're like, well, that's not really a contradiction and it can be reconciled. I hear you for some of these, but it's the differences right now that I want to point out. For a list of contradictions, you can go to Matthew. I'm trying to change this one up a bit. So we've covered the things that have been left out so far. A quick recap of that would be like the genealogy or the birth narrative or much of the teachings and parables. We covered the resurrection account. The biggest difference in Mark is you just have the women running away and not telling anyone until we get further manuscripts where this was clearly added. We have the main difference with the messianic secret, differences within the role of women. I think we've covered all that. So let's get to my general list here. The temptation accounts are different of Jesus in the wilderness. In Mark 1, 12 through 13, it's very brief, but Matthew and Luke give us a lot more detail because they are, again, trying to further expand on what it means and also make connections back to fulfill some of these ideas of the new Moses or new Elijah, etc. The healing of the paralytic in Mark, it's very specific, which is actually kind of a reversal. We know where it occurs. It's in Capernaum. We know that it was lowered through the roof, but that is not the detail that we get in Matthew 9, where it is just glossed over and we don't know the location. We get some Sabbath observant differences between the stories in Mark 2 and Matthew 12. The cleansing of the temple is something that's a bit different. In Mark 11, it's happening at the end of Jesus's ministry, but in John 2, it has it at the beginning. There's good reason for that in the case that John is trying to build, but we'll cover that more when we get to John. We have different accounts of the feeding of the 5,000. It's pretty similar between Mark and Matthew, but John again gives us a lot more details with the boy and the loaves and the fish. The transfiguration accounts, who was there, if they were sleeping or had just woken up, etc. That's a bit different between Mark and Luke. Jesus's entry into Jerusalem between Mark and John is a bit different. Same thing with the anointing at Bethany. It's interesting. We saw a lot of contradictions in Matthew with Luke, and here we're seeing a bunch with Mark and John, and that doesn't do all the other little crossed wires that can happen here. Even a difference in focus is something that is really interesting. So in Mark 14 at the Last Supper, it's very heavy on Jesus breaking bread and sharing wine, where in John 13, the focus is more on the washing of the disciples' feet. We get a really weird detail in Mark 14 where a young man flees naked during Jesus' arrest that's not found in the other Gospels. It is truly just very random. Slight differences in Peter's denial between Mark 14 and Luke 22. Mark 15 is a really brief description of Jesus before Pilate, where John, they have quite the dialogue. The crucifixion details are a straight up contradiction. In Mark 15:25, Jesus is crucified at the 3rd hour, while in John 19:14, it states it was the 6th hour. In Mark, as we've covered, in 15:34, Jesus' last words are the my God, why have you forsaken me? Matthew has the same words. Luke changes it to Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And then in John, we have the it is finished. So 3 differences between the 4 gospels. I like thinking about that, right? Like whoever wrote Matthew was reading Mark and was like, yeah, I'm okay with this. He understood the callback to the Psalm, and it still didn't do anything to take away from the Jesus that he was portraying. But whoever wrote Luke was like, no, I think we can do better. And Luke makes those changes. Luke is interesting. I'm really excited to cover Luke next week. In Matthew, we have a guard at Jesus' tomb, but that detail is left out in Mark. In Mark, we have a young man in white that appears at the tomb. But in Matthew, this is an angel that descends and rolls back the stone and speaks to the women. Of course, as we've talked about, Mark's original ending does not include the Great Commission, but Matthew does. So this could play out a couple different ways, right? Did Matthew add in all of these details, and then later manuscripts of Mark were like, hey, this seems pretty important. Mark didn't cover it. Let's add it back into Mark. Or did the adding into Mark happen after the fact, late enough that when Matthew copied it, it was already there? We have geographical issues between Mark 5 and Matthew 8 when it comes to the man who was demonic. Also in those accounts, the number of men healed is different between 1 and 2. Different attitudes in the family in terms of how they thought about Jesus. You know, Mark 3:20-21 shows it as his brothers thought he was out of his mind, where in John 7, it's just more mentioned his brothers didn't necessarily believe him, right? Like very different takes. Again, John is trying to minimize some of the more negative connotations and assumptions about Jesus. You can just see it. The prayer in Gethsemane is really interesting. In Mark 14, we have this prayer happening 3 times, and he's asking the disciples to stay awake, which is so interesting in its own right. But then in Matthew 26 and Luke 22, we get different levels of detail in this scene, and then also, of course, angelic support. Mark does not mention the death of Judas, which is fine. Matthew does, and it's different than what is mentioned in Acts, as we have already covered. But not mentioning the death of Judas at all makes it look like Judas's death is something that is kind of made up after the fact and then is not agreed with. So again, differences, not necessarily contradictions, but problematic in their own right. In Mark, we have Simon of Cyrene is compelled to carry Jesus' cross, but in John 19, it states that Jesus carried his own cross without mentioning Simon's involvement. So I've seen people try to rectify that, like, oh, maybe Simon started it, Jesus finished it, or vice versa. But in one, have Jesus being the only one who carries the cross. And I think, again, John is trying to create something here, and Jesus carrying his cross the whole time is much more powerful. And Mark was still closer to a version of the truth. Even where he was embellishing, he hadn't thought to embellish everywhere that all the others do. The veil of the temple. In Mark 15, the temple veil tears from top to bottom at Jesus' death. But in Matthew, we get the additional signs like the earthquake and the resurrection of the dead, which Mark does not mention, and which I forgot to mention in Matthew. You know, a lot of people like to talk about the Jewish zombies, and that's fine. It is a pretty accurate description, but I also get how it just turns people off immediately and makes it sound like non-believers are just trying to be ridiculous for ridiculousness' sake. The ridiculous thing is that that's mentioned in the Bible as truth. That's what's ridiculous. An atheist calling it what it is not ridiculous. Again, I do understand it. But can we just talk about that for a minute, since we didn't talk about it in Matthew? Who got to come up and who stayed dead? How long did these people stay alive? What did they do? They went and visited with their family and friends. What did that scene look like? Did they have to go back to their graves and lie down and become dead? Did they live natural lives and continue to live? This story's insane, and we don't talk about it enough. And can you imagine if that actually happened? There's no way that Mark just forgot that detail. That's the kind of thing where, yeah, it's not a blatant contradiction because Mark leaves it out, but in what world does Mark include a detail like the naked guy running away when Jesus gets arrested, but forgets to talk about all the dead that rose during the earthquake at the moment of Jesus's death? That alone should show you that we have major problems in consistency and truth-telling within the Gospels. The calling of the disciples. So in Mark 1, Jesus calls his first disciples, Simon and Andrew, with a simple invitation: come, follow me. But In John, again, when things are really amped up, this is in 1:35 through 42, Andrew and Simon are directed to Jesus by John the Baptist, and there's more extensive interactions there. And gosh, there's really so much more. And again, we covered a bunch of them in Matthew, and I want to save some specifically for Luke and John. So I think what we'll do is go ahead and move straight into problematic passages. So we've already covered a lot, actually. For instance, Matthew also had the Gentile woman that Jesus called a dog. We don't need to cover that again. We've covered the messianic secret and the issues I think that pertain to that. We've talked about the fig tree. We've talked about the ending of Mark that was added in and why the Great Commission that comes with all those great powers is problematic. But let's go to Mark 5, 1 through 20. This is where Jesus cast out the demons into the pigs. First of all, what a weird thing. The demons are essentially asking for mercy, which Jesus gives them and sends them into these pigs. It says 2,000 that then run off and die. Now, many Christians, and even for that matter, many non-believers, just won't care that Jesus killed 2,000 pigs for no reason. In fact, not just no reason, but at the request of the demons. So even if you can't get on board from that issue, how about the livelihood of the people that relied on those 2,000 pigs? There's no follow-up there. Why? Because it doesn't happen, because it's just a story anyway, so the authors don't have to concern themselves with this. But if we're supposed to take it as literal truth, this is Jesus essentially favoring demons over people's livelihood and the lives of these 2,000 creatures, let alone the fact that this person clearly wasn't demon-possessed, and that the Jesus of the Bible, if he did indeed go around thinking he was doing exorcisms, didn't have an understanding of mental or physical illness, and that it is not related to demons, bad spirits, or sin. It's just such proof that Jesus, if he really did say and do these things or try to do these things, was a product of his time and place and not the creator of everything. Jesus' teaching on divorce, I think, is pretty sad here. We get no acceptance or understanding of people that are put in tough marital situations, like sexual immorality or abuse. Not that Matthew even gives us an abuse out. And even to, after divorce has happened, essentially make it a permanent sin, a lifestyle sin, to remarry is something that is still talked about and a source of contention for Christians today. Because guess what? Christians still divorce at the exact same rate as non-believers. Isn't that hilarious? Can we just also talk about that for a second? Moses actually gave outs. Here's how you get divorced. This is how you do it. Jesus said, what God brought together, let no man take apart. And here in Mark, there's not even an exception for sexual immorality. And yet Christians have no problem divorcing at the same rate as non-believers. Meanwhile, many of those same Christians will tell you why gay people shouldn't be allowed to get married, because there's verses in the Old Testament that call it an abomination. The Old Testament where divorce is permitted, which they like that part, even though it's in direct contradiction to what Jesus teaches here. There's another contradiction for you and a problematic passage all wrapped up in one. Okay, next up, we have something from Mark 4, and I want you to pay attention because this might be the worst thing in the entire book. Mark 4, and we'll go to verse 10. And when he was alone, those around him with the 12 asked about the parables, and he said to them, to you has been given the secret of the kingdom of God, but for those outside, everything is in parables, so that they may indeed see, but not perceive, and may indeed hear, but not understand, lest they should turn and be forgiven. I'm sorry, what? I mean, how crystal clear do you need this to be? In secrecy, Jesus, amongst his friends who he has let into the inner circle, yeah, he's going to give them the real truth, but he speaks in parables supposedly to those on the outside so that they won't understand, so that they'll be confused, so that they'll have some access, but not enough, lest what? They turn and be forgiven? And I've heard the apologetics on it. I think it's nonsense. I think that what we got was an unfortunate saying of Jesus that made it into the Bible that is the antithesis of how people like to claim Jesus. And so we just don't preach on this. And if it does come up, we have these horrific excuses for it. The first thing that Christians try to say is, so you have to do some work. It tests your faith. And for those that want to see, they'll be able to see. But that way Jesus can disseminate his truth among the masses, and he doesn't have to worry about what? Like, where do you even go from here? He doesn't have to worry about people who don't want to see, people with hard hearts, people with deceived spirits, learning the truth. It doesn't even make sense at all to try to come at it from this angle. Isn't the whole point of Jesus as a man, as a human being on earth to give us clear directive from God, to help us understand who he is, who God is, what salvation is, and why we need it? To what purpose could it ever be beneficial to hide information, to purposely confuse? The only good justification I've heard is that it is in reference to a prophecy in Isaiah 6. And so Jesus was just using this to show his divinity. But still then, what a disgusting way to have to prove that you are who the Old Testament talked about, just to follow up on something that was bad back then and make it worse now. I don't understand how people can excuse this kind of a thing. This is clear unfairness, just like how he treated the Gentile woman. Calls her a dog, and only because of her sharp wit and quick quip did he decide he would wave his magic finger at her. We know what he really thought. Here again, we get that insight into the mind of Jesus, and it's not good, it's not fair, and it's not for everyone. But moving on. Let's see. A lot of people might bring up Jesus's anger in the temple. I don't actually have a problem with that. I totally get the justifications for righteous anger. I get what the temple had turned into and what Jesus's view of it should have been, and that not all anger is bad, except that isn't it Jesus himself that says if you have anger in your heart for a brother, it's the same as murder? It's a little problematic. So is there such a thing as justified anger? I think so. Did Jesus think so? Not clear. Let's go to Mark 9. I know we're jumping all over the place. I apologize. Mark 9:42. Whoever causes one of these little ones who believes in me to sin, it would be better for him if a great millstone were hung around his neck and he were thrown into the sea. And if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. It is better for you to enter life crippled than with 2 hands to go into hell, to the unquenchable fire. So this is problematic for a few reasons, but mainly it's because it's so extreme. And if Jesus were real and his teachings were real, I guess you might expect that kind of extremism, that if Earth is temporary, at best 120 years, and eternity in heaven is possible, or eternity in hell, or whatever he's alluding to here, because I know all of the ways that people try to make this about annihilation. Either way, and even if it's hyperbolic, this has still caused so many Christians to cut things out of their life, people out of their life, for fear that they are going to get in the way of their eternal reward. It's just a horrendous place to come from. I see it as completely disbeneficial, especially in lieu of the fact that this isn't real. Right before that, we have something also highly problematic. Mark 9:38. John said to him, "Teacher, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we tried to stop him because he was not following us." But Jesus said, "Do not stop him, for no one who does a mighty work in my name will be able soon afterward to speak evil of me. For the one who is not against us is for us. For truly I say to you, whoever gives you a cup of water to drink because you belong to Christ will by no means lose his reward." More in-group, out-group. That's all I see here. It doesn't matter if he's not part of our group. If he's doing stuff in my name, that's good enough. If someone is helping you because you're helping me, that's going to equal some kind of salvation for them. I mean, it really flips the whole morality concept as something that is objective to, no, it's whoever falls in line. It truly is just coming down to divine command theory, even with the Jesus of the New Testament. We obviously see that about the God of the Old Testament, but Jesus was supposed to be different. Jesus was supposed to bridge the gap, to break religion. And here we just see more of the same. In Mark 8:33, we get the rebuke of Peter. And during my time as a Christian and even as a non-believer, I've gone back and forth on how I feel about this verse. I'll kind of just share those thoughts with you. We have Jesus predicting his death and Peter saying, no, it can't be. And of course, Peter is saying that for 2 reasons. 1, he deeply loves and cares about Jesus. And 2, he expects Jesus to be the Messiah. And he hasn't done all the messianic things yet. And so how can he go off and now die? And Jesus has this very harsh rebuke for Peter. And he says, "Get behind me, Satan." As if Peter's advice, or like, can we figure something else out here? How do we get you to avoid this suffering is wrong? Because again, as Jesus is establishing for us the Christian persecution complex, it is better to suffer and die for Christ. To live is Christ. To die is gain. And anyone who thinks differently, you're the devil. Next, going to Mark 14. This is just fun for me because I am a determinist and I think that issues with free will in the Bible are fascinating in and of their own. But Jesus's prediction or prophecy or whatever you want to call it of Peter denying Jesus 3 times, telling Peter that that's going to happen, and then Peter still fulfilling that, even though he knows about it, is trying to avoid it, and doesn't want it. That to me has always been so strange and such a fun philosophical idea on, is there free will then? I mean, you get told by a man that you supposedly trust with all your heart that you will do something. You say, no, I won't. I don't want to do that. To do that would be wrong. And you do that. Something that isn't just a slip of the tongue once, but a purposeful action 3 times? That's a fascinating thought experiment all around to me, but kind of off course here. So getting back on course, let's go to 9:19. 9 has a lot of issues for us, but let me read you 9:19. And he answered them, O faithless generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear you? Bring him to me. This is in response to his followers not being able to cast out demons. And what's funny is after he gets the demon out, his disciples ask him in private, like, why couldn't we? And he goes, oh, it was a special kind of demons, the kind that only comes out through prayer. So Jesus has this chastisement of his disciples for their lack of faith, but when asked privately again, what was the issue? He doesn't say it was their lack of faith. He says he just had certain knowledge of this particular kind of demon and how it only responds to a particular kind of incantation that the disciples at the time had no way of knowing about. Jesus is just now teaching them about it. His weird temper and being tired of dealing with them when it's his job to teach them. He called them. This isn't something they've messed up. This was like their first try at it. And obviously he had knowledge they didn't have that allowed him to do it and them not to do it. This just goes to show, again, in any comparison you make about Jesus being the perfect father, the perfect friend, the perfect mentor, same thing with God or Yahweh. No. Speaking of his harshness and his judgment, let's go to Mark 6. He went away from there and came to his hometown, and his disciples followed him. And on the Sabbath he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astonished, saying, where did this man get these things? What is this wisdom given to him? How are such mighty works done by his hands? Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary, and the brother of James, and Joseph, and Judas, and Simon? Are these not his sisters here with us? Of course, the sisters don't get names, by the way. And they all took offense at him. And Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honor, except in his hometown, and among his relatives, and in his own household. And he could do no mighty work there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them. So this is fascinating and something that people love to talk and debate about. I get it. Let's say Jesus is really the Messiah and he has grown up in this area, and here are his friends and family from before, and he has now become this great man and supposedly the Messiah. People who knew him as the carpenter's son from probably that sketchy marriage situation are like, what? This guy? Which begs to question, what was Jesus like during his first 30 years? Was he not showing any of the signs of being the Son of God that now all these people would be like, oh, that makes sense. Remember how he was as a kid? No, they're taken aback by him. But the biggest issue here is that he could not do these same signs and wonders among them because of their faith. Is God's power dependent off our faith? I get if he chooses to want to bless an individual based off their level of faith and adoration, but simply it's saying that he could do no things because some, not all, were around who didn't believe in him. This is a limitation that does not equal omnipotence. And once again, even if you make excuses that it's a judgment, it's collective judgment. It's a collective punishment among the people. There were people there that needed Jesus's special works that now Jesus just couldn't perform because some other people there didn't like it, didn't believe him, thought it was weird. How sensitive is this Jesus? How insecure. His power was literally affected by his haters. That's not what I picture when I think about the God of the universe. It's also not what is depicted elsewhere in the Bible. Can you imagine if Yahweh and Elijah just couldn't get their altar to catch on fire back, when God liked being tested amongst all of those people that didn't believe in Yahweh, and a billion other examples like that where the story just breaks down completely. And let's end with one more, a real doozy, the unpardonable sin. This is from Mark 3:28. We get Jesus talking about the unforgivable sin, blaspheming in the Holy Spirit, which to this day, despite all believers having the witness of the Holy Spirit and anyone that asks for wisdom being granted it, cannot be agreed upon by Christians about what it actually means to blaspheme the Holy Spirit. Halfway because Jesus is so vague about it here. And you would think if there is one sin and only one sin that cannot be forgiven, you might want to be a little more specific with that. And then also, why do we have a sin that can't be forgiven? All that says to me is Jesus' sacrifice, his atonement, wasn't quite powerful enough to actually cover all transgressions. This fails every way to Sunday. So I hope that this was entertaining and educational and interesting, that you've gotten a better understanding of at least two of the Gospels so far. Stick around though. More to come with Luke and John for sure. I appreciate everyone that is helping drive forth the popularity of Secular Bible Study Series. Matthew was our best episode by far in terms of kind of an opening Sunday, and I really believe in this resource. I put this together for a reason. It's not perfect. I'm not a scholar. I'm sure I've made mistakes. I'm sure I've gotten a few things out of context. I do not claim perfection. But in the 41 episodes we have done thus far, I really believe that I am able to put things in front of Christians, in front of doubters, in front of those deconstructing their faith that they simply cannot get from the believers in their life, that they are simply not hearing from those in spiritual authority over them, that are in this Bible, that are issues, that are clear, that do change the nature of this God and the potential possibility of its truth. So that's all I have to say for today. Thanks for being here. I'll see you Sunday with another video. Lots of mini mind shifts in between. And until then, keep thinking. I wanted to personally thank my top tiers of support: my Iconoclast and Boris, GVI, Jacob, Joe, Martin, Oliver, Perry, Rokkit, and Shawn, my Humanist heroes, Jarrod, James, and Kristi, my Atheist advocates, Caleb, Imposter, Jeff, Jeffrey, Karen, Sparky, and Todd, as well as all of my Secular Scholar patrons. If you believe in the mission of the channel or you just enjoy the content, please consider joining these fine people. Thanks and have a great day.